The restaurant was the kind of place most people only saw in movies. Soft lights hung from the ceiling like small stars. Glass walls showed the city glowing outside. Every table was covered with white cloths, so clean they almost looked untouched. The sound of low music mixed with quiet conversations and the clink of expensive glasses. The waitress moved carefully between tables, holding a tray with steady hands. She wore a simple black uniform and her hair was neatly tied back. Her face was calm, but her eyes stayed alert. She had learned long ago that mistakes were not forgiven easily in places like this. Tonight was important. Everyone working there knew it. A powerful company executive had booked a private section of the restaurant. He was hosting foreign investors, people who controlled money, deals, and futures. The manager had warned the staff again and again to be perfect. One wrong move could cost someone their job. The waitress had served many difficult guests before, but she could feel the tension the moment she approached the table. The executive sat at the center, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room. His voice was loud, confident, and sharp. Every time he spoke, others nodded quickly, afraid to disagree. She greeted the table politely and placed the menus down. Most of the guests barely looked at her. To them, she was just part of the background, like the chairs or the walls. She was used to that. What she was not used to was the way the executive stared at her for a moment longer than necessary. One of the investors pointed at a section of the menu written in another language and asked a quiet question. The executive waved his hand impatiently and laughed. "These fancy places always try to act international," he said. "Half the staff doesn't even understand what's written here." The waitress felt her chest tighten, but she kept her face neutral. She leaned slightly forward to listen. Before she could speak, the executive turned to her directly. "You work here," he said with a smile that wasn't kind. The room had quieted, but it was filled with an undercurrent of respect and surprise. The investors continued discussing softly among themselves, clearly impressed by the waitress. She stood just a few steps away from the table, her posture calm and steady. Her voice had carried knowledge and dignity, and it had shifted the attention and energy in the room completely. The CEO sat back in his chair, trying to recover. His previous arrogance was gone, replaced with tension and disbelief. He realized, more sharply than ever, that he had underestimated her. His attempts at humor and mockery had backfired completely. Every word she had spoken had highlighted his ignorance and arrogance. And the investors had noticed it too. One investor, a woman with a keen expression, turned to the waitress and asked, "Have you always worked in hospitality, or do you have other experience?" The waitress gave a small, polite smile. "I have studied languages and cultures abroad," she said. "I have spent years learning to understand not just words, but the meaning and context behind them. Life circumstances brought me here, but my knowledge has always been with me." The investors exchanged looks. They could sense there was much more to her story than she was revealing. They recognized talent, knowledge, and experience behind her calm demeanor. One of them leaned forward, curiosity in his eyes. "Where did you study?" he asked. She paused for a moment, then answered carefully. "In several countries, learning directly from teachers and communities. I focused on languages, culture, and how people connect through understanding. It was my passion long before I took this position." The CEO's eyes narrowed. Recognition flashed in his mind. He remembered a time, years ago, when he had been presented with a proposal, written carefully and with insight. He had dismissed it too quickly, thinking it was unnecessary or overcomplicated. Now he realized with discomfort that the same kind of intelligence was standing before him, quiet but powerful. One of the investors smiled, impressed by her humility and clarity. "It is rare to meet someone who has such knowledge and can communicate it so clearly," he said. "You have a remarkable ability. The waitress nodded, accepting the compliment with calm grace. She did not boast, nor did she try to elevate herself unnecessarily. She understood the power of quiet confidence, of letting her abilities speak for themselves. Her goal had never been to shame anyone, only to demonstrate knowledge, understanding, and respect. The investors began asking more questions, curious about the depth of her knowledge. She explained nuances of the cuisine, traditions behind the dishes, and the careful choices made by the chef. She discussed techniques, flavor combinations, and even small cultural details that most people would overlook. Each explanation revealed her expertise, patience, and thoughtfulness. The CEO, who had tried to assert authority, now sat silently, visibly uncomfortable. He realized that he had been outshone not by force, but by intelligence and composure. He had expected to dominate and humiliate her, but she had commanded respect effortlessly, and the investors had recognized it. One of the investors leaned closer, asking about her background and how she had developed her skills. The waitress shared parts of her story with dignity, explaining that while life circumstances had brought her to her current position, her education and experiences had given her a foundation that could not be taken away. She spoke of challenges, learning, and personal growth, without anger or resentment, and her words carried weight and authenticity. The room listened intently. The investors were visibly impressed, nodding in understanding and respect. The CEO's expression reflected a growing sense of defeat, as he realized he could not overshadow her presence or knowledge. His arrogance had been exposed, not through confrontation, but through her calm authority and clear expertise. The waitress continued to answer questions and share insights. She explained how understanding culture, language, and context could influence not only cuisine, but communication and relationships. Her explanations were thoughtful, precise, and enlightening. The investors began discussing opportunities, recognizing that her abilities could bring value far beyond the role she currently held. The CEO tried to interject once more, but the investors, now clearly aware of the situation, politely redirected their attention back to her. He sat back, helpless, realizing that he had lost the control he thought he had. Her intelligence, patience, and composure had turned a situation meant to embarrass her into an opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities. As the dinner progressed, the investors spoke among themselves, considering possibilities and collaborations with her. The waitress observed quietly, aware that her calm, confident responses had shifted perceptions. She had maintained her dignity, answered with precision, and revealed her knowledge without arrogance or aggression. Her coworkers, watching from the sidelines, shared subtle looks of admiration. They had seen her handle a situation that could have been humiliating and had turned it into a display of skill and intelligence. Her poise inspired respect, showing that true capability could not be judged by appearances or position alone. Finally, the waitress concluded her explanations, returning to the service station with the same composed movements she had maintained all evening. She had transformed the situation completely, turning an attempted public humiliation into a testament of intelligence, patience, and quiet power. Her performance had earned respect from the investors, and even left the CEO humbled. She allowed herself a small breath of relief, not from victory over someone else, but from the satisfaction of having remained true to herself and her knowledge. She had taken a moment that could have been damaging and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate skill, understanding, and dignity. The investors continued to speak, now including her in conversations that suggested possibilities beyond her current role. Opportunities were beginning to appear, not because she had demanded them, but because she had shown her abilities clearly and confidently. Respect, understanding, and intelligence had created openings that power and arrogance could not. The CEO sat quietly, a mix of disbelief and reluctant respect on his face. He had challenged her, attempting to assert dominance, only to have the truth of her abilities revealed in the most undeniable way. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had learned a lesson about judgment, humility, and the power of quiet confidence. As the evening drew to a close, the waitress walked away from the table with a calm sense of purpose. She had maintained her dignity, showcased her knowledge, and left a lasting impression. She had transformed what could have been a moment of shame into a demonstration of intelligence, resilience, and quiet strength. Opportunities were opening, and her presence commanded attention in ways that could not be ignored. She moved through the restaurant with grace, aware of the subtle glances of respect from her coworkers and the acknowledgement of the investors. She had turned a challenge into an affirmation of who she was, proving that true intelligence and dignity could prevail, even in the most unexpected circumstances. Tell us what hour the room was quieter than before, but the energy felt heavier, tense, and filled with curiosity. The investors were leaning forward now, fully attentive, their eyes fixed on the waitress. They had come expecting a normal, elegant dinner with polite conversation and small gestures of power from the CEO. Instead, they were witnessing intelligence and skill appearing in a form they had not anticipated. The CEO's laughter, which had once filled the room, now sounded hollow. He tried to speak, but his words faltered. His ego, which had been so confident and unshakable, had taken a sudden blow. He realized that his attempt to mock her had backfired. Every word she had spoken had highlighted his ignorance and arrogance in the eyes of the very people he had hoped to impress. One investor, a tall man with a serious expression, leaned forward. "How did you come to know all this?" he asked. There was genuine curiosity in his tone, not the kind that came with judgment or dismissal. The waitress answered calmly, maintaining the grace she had displayed all evening. "I have studied languages and cultures abroad," she said. "I have spent years learning to understand not just words, but the meaning and context behind them." The executive's eyes narrowed for a brief moment. Recognition flickered there. He remembered a proposal he had dismissed years ago, written by someone he had underestimated. He had thought the ideas were too complex or unnecessary. Now, seeing her command attention and respect so effortlessly, a cold wave of realization hit him. He had mocked the very type of mind he should have valued. The investors whispered among themselves, clearly impressed. Some exchanged glances, and small nods of agreement passed around the table. The waitress continued to explain subtle details about the dishes, their origins, and the care that went into preparing them. She revealed flavors that the menu did not mention, pairing suggestions, and cultural notes that showed depth of understanding. Every sentence she spoke demonstrated intelligence, awareness, and poise. The executive tried to interrupt, but each attempt fell flat. His usual dominance had disappeared, replaced with a rare uncertainty. He had underestimated her, and he knew it. He tried to mask it with a forced laugh and a wave of his hand, but the investors could see the cracks forming. Their attention had shifted completely, and he was losing control of the room. The waitress noticed these small changes, but did not let them distract her. She had learned long ago to focus on her own knowledge and abilities rather than the ego of others. She continued, her voice steady, translating the menu in a way that revealed both the meaning and the artistry behind each dish. She added personal insights, not to show off, but to help her listeners understand. It was natural for her to share knowledge this way. It was a part of who she was. One of the investors asked a question about a particular dish's history. The waitress smiled slightly, a small gesture of warmth, and explained its origin, including how similar dishes appeared in neighboring regions. She described the cooking techniques, the importance of ingredient combinations, and how the flavors were designed to complement one another. Each explanation reinforced her expertise, demonstrating intelligence that could not be ignored. The executive shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He realized that the spotlight was no longer on him. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless in front of someone he had assumed was beneath him. His smirk faded as he watched the waitress command respect effortlessly. He tried to remember the words he had used to mock her, and a pang of regret ran through him. He had aimed to humiliate her, but she had not only avoided embarrassment, she had impressed. Everyone in the room. The atmosphere around the table continued to change. Even the other staff, who had been quietly observing, could sense the shift. They noticed the confidence in her movements, the clarity in her explanations, and the calm authority she projected. She was no longer just a waitress. She had become the center of attention, respected for her skill and intelligence. Another investor spoke, his voice calm but filled with admiration. It is rare to find someone who can explain such things so clearly and with such confidence. You have a remarkable ability to communicate knowledge and understanding. The waitress acknowledged the compliment with a small nod. She did not boast, did not add unnecessary words, but let her actions and knowledge speak for themselves. She understood that humility combined with skill could create a far more powerful impression than arrogance ever could. The CEO tried again to reassert control, speaking louder than before. Yes, she is skilled, he said, attempting to regain authority. But let us not forget the context here. This is still a restaurant. His words fell flat. The investors, now fully aware of her competence, were no longer interested in his attempts at control. Their eyes and attention remained on the waitress, who continued to explain, translate, and clarify every detail with patience and clarity. Each moment reinforced their impression of her as capable, intelligent, and composed. The waitress then shared small stories about how certain dishes were created, the traditions behind them, and how flavors were chosen to evoke specific feelings. She explained how the chef had combined ingredients to respect both taste and culture. She spoke naturally, without any hint of anger or pride, yet every word carried the weight of her knowledge and experience. The executive watched helplessly. He realized that the very people he had tried to impress were now evaluating him based on his lack of understanding and judgment. His mockery had not only failed, it had revealed his arrogance. The room's perception had shifted entirely, and he could see it in the investor's expressions. She concluded her explanation, her voice still calm and measured. Silence followed, heavy with realization and respect. The investors nodded, impressed by both her knowledge and the way she had presented it. They had come for business, but they were now witnessing a demonstration of intelligence and dignity that was rare to encounter. The CEO sat back, defeated. His usual presence of power had vanished, replaced by quiet astonishment and a hint of shame. He had underestimated her, and now he faced the truth in the most public way possible. The waitress had revealed not just her skill, but the depth of her understanding and the strength of her character. The investors began discussing her abilities, asking questions and considering opportunities for collaboration. The executive tried to speak, but his words no longer carried authority. He had been outmaneuvered, not with aggression, but with quiet intelligence, patience, and dignity. The waitress finished her service at the table, returning to the back with the same calm and steady movements she had displayed throughout the evening. She had turned a moment intended to humiliate into a showcase of her true capabilities. She had shown that knowledge, patience, and composure could be more powerful than arrogance and mockery. Her coworkers, who had been observing quietly, exchanged looks of admiration. She had not just impressed the investors, she had inspired those around her with her poise and skill. The room had shifted in subtle ways, and she had played a part in that transformation without raising her voice or demanding recognition. As she set down the last tray, she allowed herself a small exhale. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not prideful, but grounded in the understanding that she had handled the situation with integrity. She had demonstrated that intelligence and dignity could prevail, even in the face of mockery and arrogance. In the quiet moments afterward, she reflected on how far she had come. From a girl who had studied languages and cultures, whose talents had been underestimated, to a woman who could quietly command respect and attention. She realized the power of patience, knowledge, and composure. She had proven, without anger or confrontation, that intelligence cannot be judged by appearances or position alone. At this says. The waitress took another slow step toward the table. Each movement was calm and deliberate. The tray in her hand seemed to weigh nothing, though her mind was alert and racing. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of expectation, and the curiosity that had begun to spread among the investors. Even the CEO seemed a little unsettled, though he hid it with a forced smile. She looked at the menu carefully. The foreign language on it was complex, with words that carried subtle meanings and cultural hints. She had studied these kinds of languages long ago, when she was young, full of hope and ambition. It was more than reading. It was understanding the context, the story behind every word, the intention that the chef had put into it. She felt a rush of excitement as the old knowledge returned effortlessly. The executive leaned back in his chair, smiling arrogantly, thinking he had already won. He did not yet realize that he had underestimated her completely. His gaze was sharp, his posture confident, but there was a hint of uncertainty in the way he tapped his fingers on the table. The investors were quiet, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The waitress took a steady breath and began to speak. Her voice was soft but confident, carrying authority without being loud. She translated each menu item clearly, explaining not only the words but the meaning behind them. She described how each dish was prepared, the flavors, and even the ingredients that were unique to the chef's style. One of the investors raised an eyebrow, impressed by her knowledge. Another leaned forward, listening carefully. The room felt charged, as if a small storm had quietly formed in the middle of the restaurant. The CEO's smile faltered. His voice, once loud and commanding, now carried a hint of disbelief. "Well, that's not what I expected," he said, trying to regain control. "You've clearly done this before." The waitress did not flinch. She continued, adding small details that the menu did not explain directly. She mentioned the inspiration behind the dishes, the flavors from other regions, and even the suggested pairings with drinks. Every word showed her deep understanding, not just of the language, but of culture, taste, and presentation. She was more than a waitress now. She was a knowledgeable guide, sharing her expertise quietly and elegantly. The investors exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly, impressed by her clarity and skill. They had come expecting a fancy dinner, a display of power and wealth. Instead, they were witnessing competence and intelligence in an unexpected form. Their attention was no longer on the executive. It was on her. The executive tried to interrupt to regain the spotlight. "That's enough," he said, but his voice sounded weaker than before. "You've done well, but this is just a menu." The waitress looked at him calmly, without anger or challenge. "Even a menu tells a story," she said. "It shows how much thought and care goes into what we eat. Understanding it fully requires attention, knowledge, and respect." Her words carried weight. The investors nodded in agreement. One of them whispered to another, acknowledging how unusual it was to see such depth of knowledge in someone serving tables. The executive realized, with growing discomfort, that he had set himself up to be embarrassed. His arrogance had blinded him to the simple truth: talent is not always visible, and intelligence can hide in plain sight. The waitress continued, explaining subtle flavors, textures, and the cultural significance behind each dish. She even corrected a few minor mistakes in the CEO's own pronunciation, doing so gently and without mockery. The guests were fascinated, taking notes mentally, impressed by how someone could speak with such authority and clarity. While standing in the role of a server, time seemed to slow in the room. Each word she spoke drew more attention. The other staff watched in silent admiration, inspired by her courage and skill. The executive shifted in his chair, trying to regain composure, but every gesture of confidence he made seemed forced and empty. As she finished the final translation, a quiet silence fell over the table. No one spoke immediately. The investors looked at each other, then at her, their expressions a mixture of respect and surprise. The CEO looked at her, and for a brief moment, he was speechless. His smirk had disappeared. His confidence had been shaken. One of the investors finally spoke. "Where did you learn all this?" The question was polite, curious, and genuine. The waitress paused before answering. She chose her words carefully, revealing just enough to show her expertise without boasting. "I studied languages and cultures abroad. I have spent many years learning how to understand not just the words, but the meaning behind them." The executive's eyes widened slightly. Recognition sparked somewhere in the back of his mind. He remembered a time, years ago, when he had dismissed a young professional who had presented him with detailed, well-researched proposals. He had thought her ideas were too complicated or unnecessary at the time. Now he realized that the same person, or someone with the same level of skill and understanding, was standing before him, proving him wrong. The investors were clearly impressed. One of them leaned forward and said quietly, "We could learn a lot from you." "This is remarkable." The executive tried to interject, to reassert his authority, but his voice lacked the usual force. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Respect had moved away from the man in the suit to the woman who had remained calm, composed, and brilliant under pressure. His ego, which had been inflated by arrogance, now hung like a balloon slowly deflating. The waitress felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not pride, not revenge, but the calm recognition that knowledge, patience, and composure could speak louder than arrogance and mockery. She had chosen to act with dignity, and the effect was more powerful than any loud declaration could have been. She noticed the small gestures around the room, a subtle nod from a coworker, the way an investor adjusted his posture to pay full attention, the faint glances of awe from the guests. Even the executive, though still trying to maintain a semblance of control, could not ignore the shift in perception. He had challenged her to fail, and instead, she had quietly and fully revealed her abilities. As the conversation continued, she answered more questions with the same calm precision. She explained cultural nuances, cooking techniques, and ingredient choices. Each response reinforced her expertise, her intelligence, and her presence. No anger, no defensiveness, just clarity, knowledge, and quiet authority. By the end of the meal, the investors were talking among themselves, clearly impressed and discussing opportunities to collaborate, hire, or consult with her. The executive sat back, defeated silently by his own assumptions. He had thought he could assert dominance, show off his power, and humiliate her. Instead, he had revealed his ignorance and arrogance to everyone at the table. The waitress cleared the last plate from the table with the same grace and calm she had maintained throughout the encounter. She gave the CEO a polite nod, acknowledging his position, but not submitting to it. She walked back to the service station with her head held high, carrying more than just dishes. She carried the quiet victory of skill, intelligence, and patience. Her mind replayed the moment over and over. She realized how much she had grown, how far she had come from the girl who once studied quietly in her room, learning languages and cultures for the sheer joy of understanding. Life had forced her into a role she did not seek, but tonight, She had shown that the core of who she was could never be hidden. The other staff gave her small smiles of respect as she passed by. She felt their silent acknowledgement, knowing that her courage had left an impression beyond the executive's table. The room had shifted in subtle ways, and she had played a part in that change without raising her voice or demanding recognition. As she returned to the back of the restaurant, she allowed herself a small exhale. The challenge had been met, the knowledge revealed, and dignity preserved. She had transformed a moment meant to humiliate into an opportunity to assert her true self. And in that quiet victory, she felt the first flicker of hope that the world might start seeing her differently. Not as a server, but as a capable, intelligent, and remarkable individual. She glanced at the menu. It was a language she had not spoken aloud in years, but she recognized it instantly. Her fingers tightened slightly around her tray. After the tension in the restaurant, the waitress walked back to the service station with her tray. She moved carefully, as if every step had a purpose. Her heart was still racing, but she took a deep breath to steady herself. The air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and polished wood. She placed the tray down, trying to act as if nothing unusual had happened. She closed her eyes for a moment. Memories flooded in, memories she usually kept locked away. She had not always been a waitress. Not that long ago, she had lived a different life, a life full of promise and learning. She had studied at schools where the classrooms had tall windows letting in bright sunlight. She had teachers who challenged her every day, pushing her to speak clearly, think fast, and act wisely. She had friends who shared her dreams, friends who believed in her intelligence. Languages had been her favorite. She could read, write, and speak several of them fluently. She remembered sitting in her room late at night, listening to music from other countries while reading books in their original language. She loved the way words could carry meaning beyond just the letters. It was her world, a world of ideas, stories, and possibilities. But life had a way of changing plans quickly. Her family faced sudden financial problems, more than she could handle. There was sickness, betrayal, and choices that left her with no one to rely on. Opportunities that had seemed endless vanished overnight. She could not afford to finish her studies, and the world she had worked so hard to understand suddenly felt close to her. She had taken the job as a waitress out of necessity, not because she lacked talent. At first, she felt humiliated. How could someone like her serve tables for a living? But soon she realized survival required humility. She learned to move with efficiency, to speak politely even when spoken to harshly, and to carry herself in a way that would not invite unnecessary attention. She became skilled at reading people, understanding moods, and predicting behavior. She became invisible to the arrogant, yet unforgettable to those who cared to notice. Even now, years later, that training served her well. She had mastered the art of calm in stressful situations. She had learned to listen, observe, and wait for the right moment to respond. That moment at the table with the CEO had triggered something old and familiar inside her. She could feel her old self waking up, the part of her that had once walked into classrooms without fear, ready to face any challenge. As she wiped down the counter, she thought about how people judged her every day. They saw the uniform, the tray, the polite smile, and assumed it meant she had nothing to offer. She knew better. She had a mind sharp enough to question, solve, and create. Yet she often had to hide it to protect herself from the world's cruelty and the casual arrogance of people who thought they were smarter. The sound of a glass being set down on a table brought her back to the present. Other staff moved around her, busy with orders and cleaning. No one spoke of what had happened at the executive's table, though she could feel the curiosity in the air. She caught a glance from a coworker, who gave a small nod of encouragement. That simple gesture reminded her that she was not completely alone. She thought about what the CEO had said. His words were meant to belittle her, to show the guests that she was less capable than him. He did not know that intelligence could not always be seen, that wisdom could hide behind the most unexpected faces. He had assumed she would fail, but he had underestimated her completely. And soon, he would understand that assumptions were dangerous. In the quiet moments behind the counter, she allowed herself a small smile. She did not smile at the idea of revenge, but at the knowledge that she still had control. She could decide how she responded, how she revealed her abilities, and when. Power was not always in loud voices or titles. Sometimes it was in patience, observation, and timing. Her mind wandered back to the language on the menu. She remembered the subtle nuances, the words that carried culture and meaning. She remembered how she had studied them carefully, how she had loved the challenge of translating not just the words, but the feeling behind them. It was more than a skill. It was an art, and she had the chance right here to show that art to people who had underestimated her. The memory of her old teachers came back. They had told her that true intelligence could always speak for itself, but only when given a chance. They had warned her that the world often overlooked quiet talent, and that patience was as important as skill. She felt a quiet gratitude for their guidance. Now she could see how it had prepared her for moments like this. The waitress glanced back at the table where the CEO sat, visible from the service station. He was still talking, still unaware of the storm about to arrive. She noticed the confidence in his posture, the ease in his voice. He had no idea that his assumptions about her were about to crumble. She prepared herself mentally, going through the translation in her mind. Each word, each sentence, each cultural nuance. She practiced how she would speak, how she would remain calm and measured. She knew that if she faltered, the moment would be lost. If she succeeded, she could change how everyone in that room saw her. As she picked up her tray again. Her movements were steady, almost graceful. She approached the table slowly, giving the impression of confidence she did not need to force. The executive noticed her approach and smiled, thinking he was still in control. He did not know the depth of her knowledge or the calm determination behind her eyes. The room was quiet, waiting for the next action. Even the other staff seemed to pause in anticipation, sensing the importance of the moment. The investors leaned forward slightly, curious. Something about her presence demanded attention, though no one knew why. She reached the table and looked at the menu. Her fingers traced the lines as she prepared to speak. Her voice would be soft but precise. Her words would carry knowledge, understanding, and a quiet authority. She would not yell. She would not show anger. She would simply reveal the truth in a way that no one could ignore. In that moment, the waitress was more than a server. She was a person whose life experiences, knowledge, and resilience had led her to this exact point. She was ready to prove, not through arrogance, but through clarity, that intelligence cannot always be judged by appearance. The executive still smirked, unaware that his assumptions were already beginning to unravel. The room waited in silent tension, not knowing what was about to happen. And the waitress, standing quietly beside the table, was ready to step forward and reclaim a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. "I can check with the kitchen if you'd like," she replied calmly. The executive laughed louder this time, drawing attention from nearby tables. "Check with the kitchen?" He said, "Come on. If you're so smart, then translate it. Or is that too much to ask?" The table went quiet. Even the investors shifted in their seats. This was no longer about food. It was a challenge thrown out in public. The waitress felt heat rise in her face, but she forced it down. She had learned how to survive moments like this. She had survived worse. Still, something about his tone cut deeper than usual. It wasn't just rude. It was meant to put her in her place. She took a slow breath. Her mind filled with memories she usually kept locked away. There was a time when menus like this were normal to her. A time when she sat in classrooms with tall windows, listening to professors speak in different languages. A time when people listened when she talked. But that life felt far away now. She looked back at the executive, who was watching her closely, clearly enjoying the attention. He expected her to fail. He expected embarrassment. He expected to prove something to his guests around them. Other staff pretended not to notice, but they were listening. Everyone was. The waitress lowered her eyes for a brief moment. Not in shame, but in control. She knew reacting emotionally would only give him what he wanted. "Sir," she said softly, "that section lists the chef's special dishes." The executive raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" he said. "Very impressive." He smirked and turned to the investors. "See what I mean?" A few people forced small laughs, but the sound was weak. The waitress knew she had not said everything yet. She had only said enough to keep the peace. She could feel a choice forming inside her. She could walk away, let the moment pass, and keep her job. Or she could speak fully and accept whatever followed. Her hands stopped shaking. She straightened her posture slightly, something she did without thinking, like an old habit returning. Her voice stayed calm. "It also explains how the dishes are prepared," she continued, "including ingredients that aren't listed in the English section." The executive turned back to her, surprised despite himself. "Oh?" he said. "And you know this how?" She met his eyes for the first time. Not with anger, not with pride, just steady truth. "Because I understand the language," she said. Silence dropped over the table. One of the investors leaned forward with interest. Another exchanged a glance with his colleague. The executive laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Understanding a few words doesn't mean much," he said. "Go on then. Translate it properly." The challenge was clear now. There was no backing out without humiliation. The waitress felt the weight of the moment press against her chest. She thought about rent, about long shifts, about the manager who trusted her. She also thought about every time someone had decided who she was without asking Dodd. She looked at the menu once more. The words were clear in her mind, sharper than she expected. Before she spoke, she noticed something else. The executive's watch. The accent in his speech. The way one investor held his glass. Small details that told a bigger story. This was not just a test of language. This was a test of dignity. She opened her mouth to speak, unaware that within minutes, everything in that room would change. The executive still leaned back in his chair, confident and amused. He did not know yet that the game he started was about to turn against him. And the waitress, standing quietly beside the table, was no longer invisible.